texted Jeff and asked if I could quote him today. He said, "Am I quotable?" And I said, "Yeah, you are." But Jeff and I study together every week, and it seems like every week when we get done, there'll be a little pause, and he'll say, "You know, this is hard," or "You know, this is tough." And I'll say, "Yeah, it is." Well, I don't know maybe any place that's more applicable to say than with Romans 14. Romans 14 is tough. It is about welcoming each other and about dealing with brethren that have different opinions. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Actually, the context goes a pretty good little ways here, and I'll kind of show you a little bit of that for just a minute, and then we'll get into the actual text itself. But of course, we're talking about a letter written to a congregation that was having trouble between Jews and Gentiles, and they were not getting along because the Jews were looking down their nose at the Gentiles and thought that they weren't as holy and righteous as they were because they didn't have the same long-standing traditions and relationship with God that they did. And the Gentiles were looking down their nose at the Jews and making fun of them because they thought they had to keep things that they didn't before, and those types of things. And so Romans was written to correct that, but what he has done in the first 11 chapters, of course, is talk about how God sees them. The righteousness of God, and how that none of them are righteous on their own, that the only way that they are righteous is if God gives them his righteousness, and the idea that all of them have sinned, both Jews and Gentiles have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so there's all of these ways in the first 11 chapters he's trying to help them to understand that they're not better than each other, that the only reason they are what they are in their relationship with the Lord is because of God, and they're putting their faith or trust in him. Then we got chapter 12 and the application side of this, and he talked about, that first chapter 12 about being a living sacrifice, and he talked about turning away from evil and holding on to what was good, and he talked about in chapter 13 about getting along with the people around us and the government authorities and those kinds of things. And then we get to chapter 14, and in verse 1 of chapter 14, he says, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions." So, welcome him, or if you're reading from a different translation than the ESV, it may say something like receive him or greet him or something of that nature. And if you'll look down, he says, we'll talk about a little bit more about the weak in the faith and the strong in the faith and the opinion side of this. But if you'll look on down, let's go back up here first of all. Notice in verse 3 he talks about despising and passing judgment. In verse 4, passing judgment. And this is the word in the original language means to condemn, to mark someone as guilty. And then if you look down about halfway through the chapter in verse 10, he says, "Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Why do you despise your brother?" And then verse 13, "Let us not pass judgment on one another." And then when you get down to chapter 15 and verse 1, he says, "We are who are strong have an opportunity." And when Paul wrote this, remember, he didn't have chapter and verse breaks. So he started off chapter 14 talking about the weak and the strong, and he's still talking about it in 15. "We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak." And then he's going to talk about Jesus as an example. Then in verse 7, he's going to say, "Therefore, welcome or greet or receive one another as Christ has welcomed you." And that's really the major point that he's trying to get to here in chapter 14 and 15. And then, if you go on down to chapter 16, in chapter 16, he's going to say in verse, verse 17, "I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you've been taught. Avoid them. And then back up a little bit earlier before that, he told them to greet one another, or below that is where it is. He tells them to greet one another with a holy kiss. So the context here in chapters 14, 15, and 16, and we've been talking about on Sunday nights the importance of context. That's the context of these 3 chapters, is he's going to start off talking about how that we ought to greet one another when it comes to matters of opinions. And then he's going to say not to judge or despise or condemn each other over opinions. And then he's going to say again, don't condemn over opinions. And then he's going to say that we need to welcome one another. And then he's going to say we need to greet one another. And then he's going to say you need to watch out for those and mark those who won't greet one another. Are you with me? That's the context. That's the big picture of what he's talking about here. And I've got written in my Bible, you can hopefully see, I spelled it incorrectly, I just noticed. So don't look right now. My wife, if she watches this later, she'll be embarrassed now. But that's that. They taught me better in Dresden. I just didn't always pay attention. Welcome or receive is an important word. And here's the idea of what he's going to talk about is these opinions. Now, he's not talking about things that the Bible has legislated on. Are you with me? There are things that the Bible has legislated on that we can book chapter and verse and say that's the way that it's supposed to be, or that's not the way that it's supposed to be. This is all having to do with opinions, things that God has not legislated about, things that God has not said this is the way it must be done, or this is the way it must not be done. Okay? And these opinions may be good opinions. They may be based off of well-meaning hearts of people that really love the Lord. But at the end of the day, they're still what? Opinions. See? And what he's saying is don't you divide the church over that. And what we tend to do sometimes is that person that, when it's a matter of opinion, that person that wants to take what we might call the safe side, we'll usually say that's the stronger brother. But in Romans chapter 14, the weak brother is the one whose conscience will be violated by these things that the Bible doesn't legislate on. And the stronger brother is the one that his or her conscience will not be violated by these things. Now, what that means we'll get down to eventually. I don't think that probably there's any way that I'll get through all of this tonight. So what we'll do is we'll go as far as we can, and then we'll stop and we'll come back next week and we'll talk about it some more and try to get down to the middle ways through chapter 15, and then we'll stop and maybe talk about some questions that you might have about all of those. But what he's saying is don't have disagreements about opinions. And as Jeff Parham would say, this is tough. Because I have my opinions because I think they're right. And you have your opinions because you think that they're right. But and it's fine for us to have our opinions. The problem, as he's going to talk about, is when we're trying to legislate our opinions and say it has to be my way, or we give the implication that my way is better than your way. My opinion is better than your opinion. See? And we've got to be careful about that, because one of the things that's good about studying through a book in its context or preaching through a book in its context is it makes us stress the things that the inspired writers stressed. And one of the things that you can't get around that they stress is the fact that we better take unity very seriously because God does. So, Tyler Will?
I think we think it's tough because it's hard for some of us to determine, is it
Yep. And
That's what makes it really tough.
it is, and a lot of times I think that comes from the fact of how we typically will study the Bible, of pulling this verse out to make our argument or whatever, rather than just going through the context and what does the Bible really say about that, James?
My daddy-in-law, Joe Walker, used to say everybody's entitled to their ridiculous opinion.
That's right. Yeah. Wayne Berger used to tell us that you can have a different opinion. You have every right to be wrong if you want to be, you know. So anyway, and we do have that right, but the problem is trying to force it on others, or thinking less of others because they don't share our opinion. Now, again, we're talking about opinions. We're not talking about stuff that we can, you know, I can go to the Bible and show you certain things that he says this is what you must do and this is things you must not do, whatever. But these opinions is where we sometimes get in trouble. And I think to kind of piggyback off what Coach Oliver said too, I think part of our problem with opinions is not only helping, trying to decide what is opinion and what is not, but even if we can, what makes opinions hard is my P-R-I-D-E, right? Now, how many times has he told us in Romans, don't boast, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to, don't think less of someone else, because that plays right into all this. So, what he says in verse 1, he says, as for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person eats something. Now, he's going to use two examples here. One is on food that they're eating, and the other is on days that they keep, right off the bat here. But the principle he started off with, verse 1, is welcome the brother that's weak in the faith, that is maybe gets offended by certain things or whatnot, has a different opinion than you. Welcome that person, greet that person, or he's going to be more specific about this a little bit later. Treat them like a brother in Christ. Have you ever noticed that things that your coworkers do or your neighbors do or whatever, that maybe your siblings have done all your life and you don't like your coworker for it, but you'll put up with it from your brother or your sister? You ever notice that? I mean, I had as mean a brother as there ever was, you know. But he's my brother. That relationship supersedes things, see. And that's the idea here is that we're treat each other like brothers and sisters, and he'll go into more about that. But his first example is that one person, and I've kind of got this diagrammed with, if you can see my color scheme up there. The weak I've kind of underlined in pink. The strong I've underlined in orange. I don't know why I picked that, because of Auburn, how strong they were in orange the other night, I guess. Green is opinions, purple are bad thoughts, and blue is going to talk about God. But this one who's weak in the faith, welcome him. And the first one he talks about is this one person. This will be the strong brother who believes that he can eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Now, a lot of people will go to Romans 14 and talk about meat offered to idols. That may be what he's talking about here, but he never says that here in Romans chapter 14. It could be that that was the problem and why some would and would not eat certain meats. It could have been that they just, in their culture that they lived in the world that they lived in, the pagan society around them, that they just said, you know, the vast majority of meats you can go buy at the restaurant or at the meat market or whatever has been meat that's been offered to the idols, and so I'm not going to take a chance on it. It could be that some of this is just, you know, the asceticism, which is a big fancy word, that is where like the ideas or the practices of like nuns and monks and stuff came from, where they thought that they were supposed to just basically not allow their body to have any physical pleasures. They wouldn't eat good tasting food. They would not have a sexual relationship. They would not sleep on a bed. They'd sleep on the hard ground. They wouldn't wear comfortable shirts. They'd wear, rough garments that would irritate them, that kind of thing. And maybe that was some of it. Maybe it's just, the Jews that were coming out of the Jewish world and living under the old law didn't want to eat specific meat still. They still didn't want to eat the pork or whatnot, any of the unclean animals. But one person believes he can eat anything, and another person eats only vegetables. Now, what does the Bible have to say in Christ about what we're to eat or not eat? All things are clean. In fact, when Paul's writing to Timothy, that idea of asceticism was already kicking in, and people were saying you can't eat meats and that kind of thing. And he said everything that God's given us is clean. We receive it with thanksgiving. But this is a matter of opinion, see? And either one of those opinions would be okay to have, wouldn't it? He's going to talk about later in this chapter about having joy. If you're just eating salads, I'm not sure how much joy you would have, but that's beside the fact. You can still just eat vegetables if you want to. So he says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. So if you are strong in the faith and you realize it doesn't matter, any of these things that have been offered to idols or anything that maybe was unclean under the old law, whatever it might be, whatever their reasoning behind all this was, we don't know exactly, but whatever it is, if you're one of these that says none of that matters, I can eat whatever I want to, and you eat whatever you want to, that's okay. And if you're someone who thinks that, it would violate my conscience, it would bother me to eat some of those things, so I'm just going to just eat vegetables and then I don't have to worry about it, that's okay. The problem comes in whenever I think less of you because you don't eat, or you think less of me because I do eat. That's the problem. Despising the one who abstains, or passing judgment, condemning someone who has a different opinion. Now, this was a real problem in the first century church. Thankfully, we don't divide over opinions today, right? Aren't you glad of that? Isn't that a blessing that we don't divide over opinions today? Some of you are laughing at me, and I don't know what. We're going to talk about some examples as we go through this that may make you uncomfortable, and it may make me uncomfortable talking about them. But I want us to feel the uncomfortableness, because when we read about you can eat meat or not eat meat, living in West Tennessee, where it's very common for us in every one of our pantries to have Spam, potted meat, and Vienna sausages, we'll eat anything, right? So we don't feel the tension here. But there are some things that would make us feel as uncomfortable talking about as they were when they're reading this letter in front of the congregation. Because they were serious about it. You had two people, groups of people that had come together, that if you saw a Jew walking down the street and a Gentile walking down the street, you would know exactly who was the Jew and who was the Gentile. Because they dressed very differently from each other. And they talked very differently from each other. And their diet was very different from each other. And the way that they had always worshiped was very different from each other. And all of these, this was a very much as opposite almost as you could get in some cases that was being put together. And they had strong opinions. And if you had grown up your whole life being told if you eat catfish or you eat bacon, that God is disapproving of that, it's a sin, and you are in danger of your soul if you eat those kinds of things, once you're baptized into Christ on a Thursday night, you're probably not Friday night going out to eat catfish. Maybe you are, because maybe your whole life you've been sitting around going, man, I'd give anything if I could try that catfish, you know. But most likely you're not going to do that. There's still some of those things you're going to hang on to, and vice versa. But notice he says why we should not despise or condemn somebody that has a different opinion than us. And the reason why he says is because God has welcomed him. Now again, we're not talking about things God said, thou shalt or thou shalt not. We're talking about opinions. And how are you going to withdraw fellowship or think less of or talk bad about or condemn someone that God says is okay? God has allowed, remember we talked about the justification room, right? They came into the justification room. They came through the door and they're working on the sanctification to get across to Jesus. They're in the righteousness room. God's the one that allowed them in here. And then I'm going to go up to him and say, well, you got a different opinion than me. You got to get out. I don't have that authority, do I? Do I? No. Nobody does. In fact, the book of Colossians, really the idea, the main idea in the book of Colossians, it's a word that's only used about 4 times in the whole book, but there's a word in the original language that means to rule as an umpire. I don't know how many of y'all have umpired games. I know some of you have. I know Eddie refereed a whole lot of basketball games. He refereed some basketball games I played in, I think, years ago. Well, games I watched from the bench. I don't know that I played in any actually, but if we were playing, Dresden was playing Westview, and let's say, this will take a lot of imagination, but I was really having a great game. And I was, every time I shot it went in, and y'all were not liking it. All the Westview fans were, get that Sawyer's boy out of here. Do you think there's any chance that I would have said, well, okay, if y'all don't want me, I'll just... But if I punch somebody and Eddie says, you're out of here, guess what? I'm out of here. And that's what he's telling them in Colossae is who are you going to allow to rule as an umpire in your life? Jesus is the only one that can. If God has welcomed them, then what am I supposed to do? Back to verse 1. Welcome him. But he's got a different opinion. Okay. But they do things differently. Okay. Well, I'm not comfortable with that. Okay. But guess what they still are? They're my brother and sister, and they're God's child because he said so. So, who are you to pass judgment or condemn on the servant of another? And he's talking about someone who is a servant of God. It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So I don't have the right to tell God's servant, because you don't agree with me on a matter of opinion, you're out of here. Only God can do that, right? And God has received them. So then he uses his second example, verse 5. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So you've got the Jewish brethren that all their life they had been raised that on the Sabbath day, and Sabbath means 7. I know on the Andy Griffith show they said good Sabbath, but Sunday's not Sabbath, it's Saturday. On the 7th day of the week, on the Sabbath day, they were not supposed to do anything. Okay, and they're very strict about that. I think I've told y'all before, whenever some of y'all that have been to Israel can verify this, but you go to these big city hotels and they'll have 2 different elevators. They'll have one for the Gentiles like us, and then they'll have the other one that's called the Shabbat elevator. The Shabbat or Sabbath elevator stops at every floor. So we're on about floor 12, I think, in Jerusalem Hotel, and we get on the thing, and at floor 2 we stop, and I look out, there's nobody. We go up to floor 3, and it stops. And there's nobody, and I thought, some kid is playing tricks on us, you know. But it stops at every floor. The reason why, because if they push a button, it sends an electrical charge, a spark. That's like, in their mind, starting a fire, which is forbidden on the Sabbath. That's how serious they are about it. So if you've been raised your whole life that you don't work on the Sabbath day, then when you come around to Jesus and you're baptized into Christ on Thursday, do you think on Saturday they're just going to do whatever they want to do? Well, of course not. Their whole life they have kept the Passover, this special feast that they had to remind them of God leading them out of the bondage of Egypt. Do you think that those Jewish Christians are just going to give that up? I've got a friend that actually, who's a preacher, who actually converted a couple from Judaism. They were practicing Jews, and they had always kept the Passover as a feast day. And guess what they did even after they became a Christian? Is they celebrated the Passover. They said, now, we understand now that our Passover lamb is Jesus, and so it has a whole different meaning to us, but their whole life, for centuries, their family had done that. And there were in fact, there's lots of articles you can go from scholars that have found documentation and whatnot from way back in the early days of the Roman Empire, where there were Romans that would make fun of Jewish people for keeping the Sabbath day, and for keeping the Passover feast, and for keeping the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, or all these other days. Well, is there anything wrong with that? He says it's not. On the other hand, the pagans, they had their own holidays that they had always celebrated. They had, for example, they had, the winter solace and some of those kind of days that they had always celebrated. You think they just suddenly said, well, we're never going to do that again? Well, of course not. So he says the one who, one esteems one day better than the other, one that esteems all days alike, but each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. In other words, I should not participate in it because I feel like I have to and I'm violating my conscience. On the other hand, I should not participate because I feel like I have to and violate my conscience. Are you with me? He's going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But each should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. So what's he saying here? He's saying that, first of all, here's the way I'm thinking, Paul says. And by the way, this is the way we ought to think, is that, I don't celebrate Passover. I don't celebrate the Sabbath day. But, Levi over there, that's my brother in Christ, he does. And it's just another day to me. But to Levi, I know Levi, and the reason Levi's doing it is because he wants to honor God. And Levi's over there looking at me, and he's saying, well, Marcus over there, he's a guy that doesn't keep these days that I think we ought to be keeping. But I know Marcus, and the reason Marcus isn't is because he wants to honor God. Thinking the best of each other. Are you with me? That's hard. Now, we say it's easy. Just think the best. But if the opinions are varied, is that hard? If you got a different opinion than me, isn't that hard? It is. And we need to understand that. So, let's talk about some examples here. Let me do this and then we'll come back to some examples here. Before I get fired, I want to go through the rest of this little section here. For none of us lives to himself and none of us dies to himself. For if we live, We live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. What he's saying here is that, again, all of us understand and appreciate the fact that what we're doing as brothers and sisters in Christ that are in the justification room, and the only reason we're in the justification room is because God gave us his righteousness. We put our trust in Jesus. That we all realize that we're only here not from our own doings, but because he did it for us. And I'm going to assume that everyone in this room with me, God welcomed them in, so I'm going to welcome them in. We're all just trying to serve the Lord and grow closer to him. Does that make sense? So, one congregation that I preached at one time, we were doing question and answer on the last Sunday night of the month, like we've done here before. And I had them for about, 6 or 8 weeks. At the end of 1 year, put in their questions, and I took the top 12. And once that last Sunday night of each month for a year, we took one question and we went through it. And the number one question, can you guess what it is? The number one question that we were worried about at that congregation was, what should we wear to worship? Which was kind of a relief to me, because I thought, if that's the only thing we got to worry about, we are in good shape. But it wasn't a problem of that being the question that was asked. The problem was how the question was asked. Because it was asked in one of two ways. It was either asked as, why do some people not love the Lord enough to dress in their best for him? And half of them asked it, why are some people so conceited and want to show off so much that they want to dress up like they're going to a dress ball? Now, what they're asking about, there's nothing wrong with asking that question. I love for people to ask questions. The problem was the way we were asking that question. We were assuming some things. And so we talked about that night that there are brethren in this congregation that they will wear a three-piece, and there is in this congregation that will wear a three-piece suit and a tie because they think that's the way that they honor the Lord. And there's some people that when they come to church are wearing cargo pants and Crocs because they want everybody that comes in those doors to feel welcome and at home. Now, where in the Bible does it tell us what we're supposed to wear to church? I pulled out Cruden's Concordance. Y'all remember Cruden's Concordance? And I looked, and I couldn't find anything about suit or tie in there nowhere. But the problem was, and I tried to point this out to her, I told Melody that night on the way to church, I said, well, this will be a moving sermon. And she said, what does that mean? I said, well, they're going to be moved to repentance, or I'm going to be moving tomorrow, one of the two, you know. And I said, if I'm over here in the Crocs and cargo pants, and I'm looking at my brother over there in a three-piece suit and a tie, I wouldn't dress like that. But I know my brother, and he loves the Lord, and he's a good man, and the reason he does that is he wants to honor God. And if I'm over here in the three-piece suit in the tie section, and I'm looking at my brother over there wearing cargo pants and Crocs, I wouldn't dress like that. I wouldn't be comfortable like that. But I know my brother, and he's a godly man, and he loves souls, and he loves the Lord, and he's doing that because he wants everybody to feel at home. See, there's a difference in having different opinions and causing division over opinions. Are you with me? Of course, when we got done on, that was a Sunday night sermon, one of the elders would do the announcements, and we had 4 different doors coming out of the auditorium, and we had 4 elders, and they would get at each door, and every month they would switch so that they got to, every 4 months, they got to, shake hands about everybody. And we get through the invitation song, and I start walking back down the aisle to shake everybody out. I look up, and 3 of the elders were back there at the back door, and I thought, uh-oh. And, well, I got back there, and they kept the door shut between the little foyer area and the auditorium. The other one was up there doing the announcements. And the one elder opened the door and said, let's go out here. And I thought, they're going to do it right here. They're going to fire me tonight, you know. And anyway, we got out there, and the 3 of them got around me, and they said, we wanted to thank you for that lesson. We've needed that for a long time here. And we've been texting each other, and we were thinking that maybe there might be some that would take exception to what you said, and the 3 of us are going to stand here beside you, because if they have a problem with that lesson, they're going to have to talk to us. By the way, that's spiritual leadership, number one. But as far as I know, nobody had any problems. That's the way it's supposed to be, see. We have people that the Bible, when I was growing up, maybe y'all heard something like this. I was taught it's a sin to mix swim. Did y'all taught that? Mixed bathing is what we would call it, what I always heard. I remember, like, when I first got to a teenage class, and whoever it was teaching that day said something about mixed bathing, and I'm like, I'm not taking a bath with nobody. I don't know what you're talking about, you know. But they were talking about mixed swimming. And, man, for the longest time, I was almost to the point that if I was fishing in a boat and I saw you out there drowning, I would have just said, well, I'm sorry, I'll pray for you, but I can't swim out there. You're swimming. And if I swim out, now once you get to the bottom, I can swim out there to you maybe, I don't know. But then I looked up in the Bible, I got out my Cruden's Concordance, and I looked up swimming. And it's not in there. Now, there's some things in there about lusting after other people and dressing in a proper way to not make someone lust after you. And there's examples of like Herod's stepdaughter-in-law and the way, you know, different things like that. But there's nothing in there that says thou shalt not swim. There's just not. And then I got told, well, why? Well, it's because of the immodest bathing suits. Well, if there's immodest bathing suits, does that mean there's modest bathing suits? Well, of course there is. So it made me feel better if I saw somebody drowning. I can't swim, so I'm still out of luck, but I could have jumped in the water and you could have stood on my shoulders, I guess. But whenever I was growing up, it was a sin to go dancing. Were y'all taught that? And I got out Cruden's Concordance and I looked up dancing and I found people dancing in there. Sometimes it was godly people dancing. And then I looked up, there's lots of dancing. There's clogging, like an old man in bibbed overalls on a piece of plywood clogging. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not trying to be crude, but maybe that really is appealing to some of y'all and makes you have some bad thoughts. I don't know, but I've never seen somebody clog and say, boy, that's a looker right there. You know. There's all the way from that to bumping and grinding and doing things. And there's a whole world in between there, isn't there? So you may have an opinion that we ought not go to the beach and we ought not swim and we ought not, and that's fine. Or you may have the opinion that you know, I can go to a swimming pool and I can, you know, dress modestly or I can go dancing with my wife, or I can, you know, I can go clogging. I can put on my bibbed overalls and go clogging. Are you with me? This is we really hadn't talked about uncomfortable stuff. What about, like, does the Bible say anything about, now's when I'm going to get in trouble, but class is almost over anyway. Does the Bible say anything about Jesus being born? Yeah. Matthew 1, Luke 1 and 2, right? When are we allowed to talk about Jesus being born? Or sing about Jesus being born? Anytime. Just like I can talk about Jesus being resurrected anytime, or Jesus doing a miracle anytime, right? The Bible doesn't tell us anything about when he was born. In fact, I preached a sermon here one time where I think I can prove that it's probably in the spring or in the fall. But is there anything wrong? He says one person honors the Lord in a day and another person does not. Is there anything wrong with an individual celebrating Christmas? Is there anything with someone not celebrating Christmas? Either one's fine, right? Or anywhere in between. And some of you might now nobody laughed at that one, Steve. So now I know we're in the uncomfortable area. And you may be saying, well, I've got a different opinion than Corey. And that's fine. Where we need to be the same is to understand it's an opinion. Are you with me? And I'm not going to try to convince you to do something that's going to violate your conscience. On the other hand, you're not going to do anything that's going to make me violate my conscience. Now, he's going to talk about here in a minute about a stumbling block. We don't want to be a stumbling block. We'll talk about this more next week. But a stumbling block is not that you don't like it. It means that if I'm doing something that causes you to sin by doing something you think is wrong. So if I think that we all need to wear suits and ties and Webb doesn't think we need to wear suits and ties and I put the pressure on him and make him think he has to, and he does it even though he thinks it's the wrong thing to do, that's the stumbling block. Me wearing a suit and tie and Webb not wearing a suit and tie and him saying, I don't know why Corey wears a suit and tie. That's not a stumbling block. He hadn't stumbled. Are you with me? There's a difference in that. But understand that it's opinions. And we can have different opinions about things and still being part of God's family. So, we'll pick up at verse 10. I thought maybe there was a chance I'd get through all 30 verses I wanted to, and I got through 9. So, anyway, I'll try to do better next week. And we'll pick up at verse 10, and we'll talk about the rest of this chapter and hopefully get into chapter 15 next week. Still talking about welcoming each other, receiving each other, greeting each other, because God has received each other, so we better receive each other, even if we have different opinions. And if Jeff was here, he would say, man, this is tough. And it is. But it's also very necessary for us to understand it. Are you with me? All right, we'll pick up there next week. Those of you that are online, as Alan's getting that turned off, appreciate you being with us. We have a lot of our sick, I'm sure, that's studying with us online tonight. We're hopeful that you'll be able to be back with us in person soon. For those of you that are here, we're going to give you a